we got a lot of really knowledgeable people here, so I'm a lay person when it comes to the brain. So I would encourage, if I'm saying something that doesn't sound right to you, it probably isn't right. Okay. But I have some knowledge of kind of how it works, right? So we talked yesterday about that vagus nerve, right? Does everybody remember that? Someone remind me kind of what we said? What does that do? The purpose of that nerve?
It connects to all the major organs.
Connects to all the major organs, right. And so some of the simple exercises that Colleen had done yesterday, when we felt like the energy level was getting a little low, tapping and snapping, was to stimulate the vagus nerve, to generate some energy, get some blood flow. So some subtle techniques. So we talked about that yesterday. I think we kind of understood that. There was a handout for that, right? So now let's just follow that up. So those nerve signals are going up into the brain. And in your book, I'm not sure what page it is, but there's a hand model of the brain, Dr. Dan Siegel.
7.
Page 7. So by show of hands, is anybody familiar with Dr. Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain? Just a few. Okay, so this is an amazing, great technique or model to explain to people, particularly to your students. So the first thing I would tell you is Dr. Dan Siegel has several YouTube videos out that are way better than what I'm going to tell you, because he's really the author of this. And they're about 5 minutes long, several of them, but I would encourage you to watch his video. Dr. Dan Siegel, hand out the brain, will come right up YouTube video. But basically what he does is he has a visual model to explain how the brain works when it comes to the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So he uses the hand. So let me just show you this. So basically we have a hand up here. You can imagine this, my forearm here, being your spinal cord. And up here is your skull. And then right above the skull is your brainstem, right? So, and then the parts of the brain that are really related to regulation of the sympathetic parasympathetic nervous system would be the limbic region right here. And your prefrontal cortex, so you can think about this. So when I put this all together, maybe, can everybody just do this? I know it's kind of goofy. And put it here, so you can think about this. This is your forehead, so the front part of your, right below your second knuckle here, that's right here. So it's really easy to understand right here. So behind that is your limbic system. And then you can imagine your brain stems right here, going down through your spinal cord. And then we know that vagus nerve is going through that. And so we know is electrical impulses, synapses, right? They're going to come up the spine, and they're going to start to stimulate. You're done with the hand. You want to keep it there. It's fine with me. But I mean, it's a good visual because you can. This is your forehead right here, right? And so your limbic system, you've probably heard about those, particularly in yoga teacher training programs. Your lower brain, your upper brain, your reptilian brain, right? Does that sound familiar? Mm-hmm. So when we talk about the reptilian brain, it's really your limbic system here, which is made of the amygdala and the hippocampus. Hippocampus. How do you say that wrong? Hippocampus and the amygdala. That combines with your brainstem, and that is really your survival, form, fit, fight, flight, or freeze. Excuse me. And so when we talk about the sympathetic system, it's going to agitate that limbic system, and it's going to cause you to kind of tense up. The things you saw in your handout, about tightening up, stop digesting food, blood pressure goes up, heartbeat goes up, get ready for that, right? So how do we regulate that? Well, it's this prefrontal cortex is really the regulator. And we talked about that yesterday. The prefrontal cortex is sort of where you are now. That's regulating, right? That, okay, I understand, I'm listening, I'm empathetic, I can take this in, and I can make some evaluations. I can make some judgments if this makes any sense, or I can think about maybe the room's too hot, it's bothering me. All the things that we go on around us, we can be present, if you will. It's all controlled by the prefrontal cortex. So what happens is when we get agitated, that synapses come up here, they vibrate, if you will, the limbic system, and then it just starts to cause like the vibration here. We take a step back. The hippocampus. Anybody know what hippocampus function is? What it does?
Memories.
And why is that important?
Because any fear experiences that you have, or any
Dance, everybody hear that? So she said that if there's, one example would be fear, right? So if, let's say, when you were a little kid, you saw a snake and someone chased you with a snake or something, right? And then you started screaming, oh, snakes, right? When you were little, that's now in your memory somehow. So now when you see a snake, that comes out of that memory and it associates with an emotion. So that's why some people see a snake or spiders, oh, well, they can't take it, because there's something happened way back when that's now kind of ingrained in their brain. It works the other way. Someone might see a sunflower, sunflower, because whatever it is, it triggers something, whereas you might see a sunflower, it's a sunflower, it's nice. So that is the hippocampus does that. How about the amygdala? Anybody know what the function of that? Yes? Emotions. Right. So when we think about this in the lower level of the brain, like the reptilian brain, would be things like depression, anxiety, those kinds of things. So as this limbic system gets stimulated, these memories start to come up. You can start to get anxious, and it starts vibrating, right? And so the idea of Dr. Dan Siegel's idea is that this thing starts moving, and eventually you flip your brain. Eventually, the prefrontal cortex can't control what's going on. So now you're in like free fall, true fight, flight, or freeze mode, and something's going to happen. And this is not necessarily a bad thing, right? So this is a part of our survival mechanism. The problem is when you deal with trauma, is that how do you distinguish between what's real and what's not real? What's imaginary? What's a thought that came to you that is now looks exactly real, that it may be something that happened to you a long time ago. And so that's the issue here. So we talk about flipping your lid. It's when that prefrontal cortex loses the ability to manage your lower level brain, manage of that anxiety or these thoughts you have in your head. The interesting thing about it is that we know it's going to happen. You almost can feel it. When we become aware of our bodies, which is another reason why yoga is so powerful, is that we get a sense for what's happening inside of us. So the idea and what the thought process is that imagine you're hanging on a cliff. You're hanging on with your fingers, and it's a long cliff below. You're hanging and hanging, and eventually you feel like your fingers are wobbling and you can't hold it, and then you let go, right? It's the same idea with how you flip your lid. This happens, and these Dr. Dan Siegel says maybe you've got 3 seconds or so before, like you're about to go, and then you're gone. But there is that pause, maybe a 3 to 5 second place where you know you're going to flip your lid. You know it. And you have the ability then to, what we can do, we can take a moment, take a break, we can breathe, we can try to get ourselves out of that thought process, change our state somehow. So these are all things that happen. Now, of course, we talked yesterday about the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So that's the generator of bringing things in, up into the brain. And then the brain has to evaluate what's happening, the stimulus that's happening there. So that's essentially what's it. But what really happens is with trauma, we start to lose the ability. I think Colleen mentioned this yesterday about with the parasympathetic side of things, the accelerator is stuck on. Like all these things are happening and we're evaluating it, and it's like, oh, it's overwhelming and overloading the system. And the parasympathetic side is really the brake system. And particularly when we have childhood trauma, we lose the ability to have the brake and the gas pedal work together. And so the gas is on, the brake pedal is not used enough, and so it's not strong enough to kind of counteract things. So when things happen, events happen, they may be not real, but your brain can't distinguish between what really happened and what is a true threat to us. Does that make sense? Yeah. So again, yesterday we talked about what can we do about that. Well, it's interesting. What can we do? How we can manage that flipping the brain is breathing, which is why we talk about what tools do we have to help manage our state. The biggest one is actually breathing. Yoga, of course, is part of that, and concentration, movement, not letting our mind wander, mindfulness. All of these things are ways for us to kind of get our brain back in balance. Let that prefrontal cortex do its job to evaluate what's really real, what's not real, and then make a decision about whether if it's real, then it's going to it's going to flip the lid for a good reason, right? And so that's a lot of what's going on now with these research studies out there showing that this central nervous system, the autonomous nervous system, is what's driving a lot of our actions, and that we have the ability to control that. One last thing, there's a book out there by another doctor out there, Rick Hansen. Everybody know him? Yes. So if you want to do more about this, way more than what I just explained to you, there's a book called Buddha's Brain.
It's over there.
Do we
It's
know
over
it?
there.
Okay. So if you get a chance during the break, it is an amazing book. It's maybe a little technical, but it's probably the best book I've ever seen that combines what happens inside the brain to how we can regulate that through a yoga practice. And it's just amazing how powerful the things that we think about, and all the things we've always thought about yoga, why we just feel good, and all the reasons we do yoga. He explains exactly how that impacts the brain. Any questions? Does that make any sense?
Okay. A little
Yes, John.
thought I had also, having worked with people with trauma is, as much as good as we're trying to do, I think you had mentioned something yesterday about the danger, or somebody mentioned it, about the danger of actually certain things doing in class, certain poses, may be triggering off those memories. So as much as we're trying to heal and help people by doing yoga, there's also that danger of flipping the switch and certain things reminding people of their traumas, bringing it up rather than transcending it.
That's correct. That's correct. So that's no question about that. We have, both Colleen and I have had experience at the VA hospital in the PTSD unit, and that's very acute there. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can be triggered, not knowing it. One example, maybe just briefly explain to you. So there was one class I was teaching, and there was a gentleman in there who was in the Vietnam War, and we were doing just simple poses, sort of a little bit of a version of what we did yesterday. And I got the group into a simple, chair pose. And we didn't go that deep. It was basically this. We just basically count of 5, breathing through it. And what happened is, as we were here, he had a breakdown. He just broke down and started crying. And then, so there was lots of things. What do we do as a class? How do we handle this? But effectively, what happened after class? Fortunately, he'd been coming to class for a while, so we kind of knew each other, and he was willing to talk. He said that when he was in boot camp, he hadn't thought about this in 30 years, that his drill sergeant made him hold out his rifle like this and squat until he had a breakdown. And somehow that chair pose triggered something that happened. He said, I hadn't thought about it in 30 years. So, we used that as a moment. Of course, we didn't have a counselor in the class at that time, and we called in a counselor to help us with that, deal with that, and we talked through that. But yes, absolutely, that is something. Now, to follow through that story, that was necessarily a bad thing because he's now starting to work through that. But if it's done in not a controlled environment, maybe it's just somewhere else, who knows how that could turn out, right?
So when you're in those types of situations in like certain facilities and there is no counselor at that time, is there something specific that you guys do if something were to happen like that?
Well, so
You want me to answer that one?
yeah, I'll just say my quick one. My one is almost every situation is different. In the case of the VA, I've been going in for so long. They knew me. Mike the yoga guy's coming in, and it was after hours, and they don't like to pay anybody overtime, and so my contact person was gone, and of course they gave me a phone number, but no one ever answered the phone. So in that case, fortunately, there were a group of veterans who were really supportive of this gentleman, and so we just used that as a little bit of discussion group, and then talked about it, and just comforted him basically. But that's all I did. I don't know if that's the right thing to do, but that's all I did.
Well, I would just add that I know that this comes up a lot when we have these trainings about like triggers and things that happen. But in teaching 8 years, it really hasn't happened to me. So I just want to say that it's not that common. And it's not that common because there are other individuals. If someone is really highly agitated, it's unlikely that they're going to come into the yoga class. And now, in every setting that I'm in, there is someone else there who is qualified to handle a situation like that, right? I'm there to offer yoga and I know nothing about the rest of the stuff, and I don't wanna overstep my bounds that I do know that. So I just wanna throw that out there because it is really rare, and I know there's a lot of fear around what might happen and will I be equipped. And so if this is something that you're gonna do and set up somewhere, you know, just try to make sure that you have support in that way where there is somebody in the room.
So Colleen, so you've been teaching at least 5 years, maybe 7 years doing this kind of work. How many times do you think you've had that?
I don't have like a mini little, someone started to cry. And that was it. It wasn't like anything major. And I've had more tears in like open studio settings than in these types of settings. And I think too, a lot of it is because of the approach. And that's why when we get to like postures that we recommend, we strongly recommend them because they can create that safe container. And when you want to step out of that to do other things, that's where you may get into a situation that will be unsafe for certain people. But I don't like to say, you know, don't do this, don't do that. I'd like to really focus on what we can do because there is so much that we can do. Right? So just like flip that switch.
Suggestion, something that helped with me through the class